So I will really want to thank and welcome everyone who is here with us today. We'd like to greet everyone from Turtle Island and the Yukon, which are found in the colonized lands known as Canada. And we want to acknowledge that these are the traditional lands of the Kwilindun First Nation, the Anishinaabe, Huron, Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Seneca, and the current treaty holders, the Mississauga of the Credit. These lands are now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities, and Turtle Island territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. As I mentioned before, we do encourage participants as we're connecting from different spaces to share the different territories that you're from in the chat so that we can acknowledge the different spaces that we are calling in from today. And we do want to note that a thing that we encourage people to do while we're going through the presentation is to take the acknowledgement, to move it towards action, is to invite everyone to consider how the work we do today can better support Indigenous communities and decolonization in general. We do just have a quick accessibility statement. So we really do try and create supportive environments that encourage each of our participation in a range of ways that work for us. And this also supports each of our ability to take care of ourselves in whatever way we need. So tools that support access in the meeting could include keeping your video on or off, depending on what works best for you. We will do our best to do live description of images. If you prefer, you can just respond in the chat, and we have someone here who will read your responses out loud. And then please let us know if there are other things that we can do to improve access throughout the meeting. And you can do that by direct messaging Dr. Laura Yvonne Bulk, and she will help facilitate that. We also want to support you in taking care of your own needs. So if you need to stand up, lie down, move, stim, eat, drink, take a break, do what you need so that you can come and be as engaged with this presentation as you can. We do want to acknowledge that the format of the meeting on Zoom here creates specific challenges for everyone. Zoom fatigue is real, and so it is good and useful to take breaks when you need it. We do ask that people leave their microphones off unless you're speaking, just to reduce noise and distraction. If you do want to ask a question, you can use the raise hand function, which you can find in your menu bar at the bottom of your screen. You can also find the chat there and the closed captioning there to bring the captions up how you like. Also for Zoom fatigue, Zoom has a new function where it lets you hide your own camera view from your gallery view or whatnot. And you can do that if you see your video and then there's the ellipses up in the top right corner. You just press on that and it says a hide view function. Okay. So that is the intro stuff. So what are we doing today? We are going to be talking about the Act and Cite research project. We're going to do this by talking about some of the work that we have done. We are almost through the analysis of our interviews, and Ashley Franks is going to be introducing that. We're then going to go into the real concurrent design portion of this presentation. So we're going to give you a bit of an overview of what design looks like in this project. Then we're going to look at kind of what our knowledge mobilization plan is. And then we're going to bring those two pieces together and we'll share with you kind of one of the processes we're going through to bring those together in a breakout room activity related to story development. And then hopefully we will have some time for questions and we'll share how you can stay up to date with the project if it interests you. All right, so we do just have a couple questions that we want to do to gauge the room. Laura, could you share the link for the polls? So we have 2 polls. Just a sec, I will bring them up so you can see. So there's 3 things in the polls that when you enter it, you'll see the details of. So one of the question is, what field do you work in? So just getting an idea of the different spaces people are coming from. And then we have another question called, do you work, does your work support placements in your job? And then we just have a little more casual one, since we'll be doing some breakout rooms later, that's asking about what kind of hobbies you've begun, returned to, or have never stopped over the past year. And while you guys are answering those questions, I will just give you a short introduction to Act Insight itself, and then we'll come back to those results. So Act Insight is a government-funded research project that really aims to improve accessibility and accommodations in work integrated learning. The project itself is very focused on the healthcare field, but that is something with the knowledge mobilization we're hoping to bridge out of. Our real main goals within the project is working and using participatory research methodologies. And within that, we have a steering committee for the project made up of our partners from our 5 institutions, which are Sick Kids Hospital, Sunnybrook Health Science Center, York University, University of Toronto, and George Brown College. We also have an expert panel of people with disabilities. We had our first meeting in April and it was absolutely great. And then we have the participatory design process, which is what we're going to be going into and talking about more today. The project itself is funded by SHRC, which in Canada is a kind of a big government funding pot that you can get grants for. It was good. All right, and I dislike that I have to keep stop sharing and resharing, but that is life. Okay. So we've got some people from higher education, some people from knowledge mobilization, broader impacts, and university admin. Okay.
We can't do the poll simultaneously. Now this one is activated.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah,
okay.
Sorry about that.
No, that's fine.
We'll go quick. So here we have 4 results. Tell me and I'll show the results.
You can show the results. All right. So 75% of the respondents said that their job supports placement. And that's great because that's what we're talking about. But it's good to know that activity there. And then we can move to the hobby ones. Melanie?
Yep, it's live.
Okay.
Are we allowed to respond?
Go right ahead.
That's mine.
We've got gardening, hiking, reading, ooh, jewelry, watching, making. Ooh, I like how the things are all moving around.
TV. Exercise is not listed here. Well, the hiking is there.
Oh, someone started sewing.
I did.
It's very domestic of you.
Yes. And I do it by hand.
There's a number of walking.
Actually, I walk too. I'm emphasizing that.
Mm. Okay. All right. Well, we do have to move on to the next piece. So walking is definitely like pulling ahead in the hobbies area. So I look forward to getting to know people more in the breakout groups later on. For now. So the next section is just talking about why is the Acton site project important. And so if anyone saw the keynote that happened just before this with Wendy Sukri, you know that she spoke about the fact that people with disabilities, even if they get higher education, have lower employment rates. So 2 pieces of disability related stats related towards that really kind of focus on what is important, why this is important for our work is that among graduates age 25 to 64, those with disabilities are less likely to be employed after graduation, so 49%, than those without disabilities, 80%. And then we also have seen an increase in registration in Ontario, Canada, of people with disabilities. So the quote says, between 2003 and 2011, there was a 69% increase of people registering with accessibility services within Ontario, Canada. So we see an increase of people with disabilities going into higher education, and that means entering into spaces with work integrated learning, but they're still not getting the opportunities upon graduation. So Ashley is going to introduce some of the information that we found throughout the interviews.
All right, hi everyone. As Hilda said, my name is Ashley and I'm going to be presenting our findings from the interview analysis segment of our Acton site project. So to give you a little bit of a background on the project, we completed interviews, 29 different interviews across multiple different roles, professional affiliations, educational institution affiliations. Just next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, so our participants came from 6 sites of educational institutions and clinical practice sites. As I said, affiliated with various professions such as nursing, occupational therapy, and social work, and various roles in educational institutions and placement sites. Next slide, please. So the analysis consisted of 3 phases. In the first phase, the analysis team reviewed the transcripts and they formed a 12-code framework, or what we like to call buckets. And in phase 2, the coding team sorted those 29 transcripts. They read through each of those interviews and applied those codes or tags to different segments of the interview that matched with those respective codes. And I'll go through those in a second as well. In the third phase, the analysis team reviewed each of the buckets and they formed themes that we saw. Next slide, please. So our coding framework, as I said, consisted of 12 different codes. So we had relationships, this was institutional or personal relationships, resources both desired and already present, responsibility assigned, which was when somebody was, or an institution or process was to blame or to thank for a good or bad experience, stories, solutions and strategies, time, or a lot of times lack of time, challenges, emotion. So this was when people showed a particularly strong emotion within the interview. Master narratives about professions and disability, motivations and priorities, process, which was reference to paperwork or specific institutional processes, and quotables, which was just when somebody articulated themselves or explained something quite well. Next slide, please. So one of the biggest themes that emerged out of this analysis was that at the moment, access for work integrated placements is a function of care and silent labor. So to give you some background on that specifically, the literature is already telling us that there are challenges in providing equitable access to placements for students with disabilities. And our analysis is based on the interviews in combination with our knowledge of what is already known in the literature, theory, and the experiential expertise of our interdisciplinary analysis team. Next slide, please. So There was 3 problematic processes feeding into this theme, and they're all featured here on this slide. But the first one, highlighted in red here, is that there are currently unclear or non-existent institutional processes to collaboratively support access in placement. So some background on that problematic process specifically. Next slide, please. There is a lack of clarity in institutional support across roles, institutions, and professions. So participants expressed that they didn't know where to go, who to talk to, how to engage with these complex processes that would facilitate access. And we do acknowledge that some of the participants that we were interviewing were aware of these processes, and some of them had even developed them. But in many instances, there were still lots of gaps remaining for the participants. Next slide, please. So this quote from the interview illustrates this quite well. This is a placement supervisor speaking, and they've said, "Oh boy, I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. I haven't actually had any sort of official training or communication. I haven't actually seen any resources specifically about coping or helping with mental health or accommodations. I haven't seen anything like that." So in this case, she just completely was not aware if there were any processes available in her institution. Next slide, please. So the first problematic process feeds into this second one here, which is that requirements for unrecognized relational care work. There are requirements for unrecognized relational care work and emotional labor, and that one's highlighted here in red. Next slide, please. So what is labor? Some examples from the data as well as the corroborating literature were that individuals were building relationships to facilitate access. And so they were really relying on that relational work, maybe with a professor or with a particular student, to facilitate individual access. We also saw that students were hiding disability, or they were strategically navigating when to disclose, which is an immense amount of emotional labor for them to engage in. And we also saw that people were managing the required procedures in an absence of clarity. So the procedures were quite complex. There was lots of paperwork to fill out. They weren't sure who to contact, or there was multiple people to contact. Next slide, please. So this quote illustrates this quite well. This is a student with a disability speaking, and they have said, "I kind of would avoid standing out in any sort of way. Again, I wouldn't ask questions even if I was confused. I would avoid speaking up during meetings, and I would just keep my head down. I would just try to get through it as best I could. I decided to keep going at it, and while it was really difficult, I learned a lot in the end, and I just knew what kind of professional I didn't want to be." Next slide, please. So the third problematic process highlighted in red on this slide that the previous two feed into is that because this work is not institutionally supported through clear processes, access is not equitably available to students. Next slide, please. So how is access happening when it does? There is an expectation that people should want to do this unrecognized work. And oftentimes the work is getting done when individuals are motivated by personal commitments, whether that's to their profession or to education or to particular students that they really care about, which sounds great, but unfortunately when the work doesn't happen, then access becomes thwarted and individuals fall through the cracks. Next slide, please. So this is an access professional speaking, and they have said, "We struggle sometimes getting people to put their hands up and say, 'I'll take a student,' because in our place, you don't get any benefit. You don't get any recognition, like financially, for taking on the responsibility of having a student." So this particular access professional is really highlighting the unrecognized labor of preceptors in the clinical placement space, because the preceptors already aren't getting recognition for taking a student. And then if you have a student who's requiring access, that's increased labor on the preceptor as well as the student. And a lot of times it leads to students falling through the cracks of that process. Next slide, please. So that is an overview of one of the main themes from our analysis. So the question that I want to pose to the audience here, and there's no wrong answers, we're just looking to gather some insight, is what are some strategies to disrupt this accepted practice of access being reliant on silent and unrecognized care labor? So you can feel free to type in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and just speak, but we would love to hear from you. And I do recognize this is probably a question that takes a couple of moments to digest.
I guess for me, it's this idea that we don't have to do something special, that what we need to be doing is be accessible all the time, because what is good accessibility is good practice in general. So like, for instance, my son has what would be considered as an invisible disability, and good practice in teaching that will help him is good practice for teaching for everyone. So it makes it so that it's not, for instance, like that student who talked before, they won't have to speak up because we're doing good practice to begin with. And I think that that would be something that here we don't do as much as I think we should.
Absolutely, Susan.
I find that something that I try to do when I'm onboarding or having new, this is more so from a employment perspective, is acknowledging that mental health and a culture around mental health is something that we need to be active towards, and that it's a commitment of myself as the manager, and also as the department, and as a university. I'm from a university, so as a university, that's a priority. And that, you know, that they are encouraged to take and use the resources that they have at their disposal and make time in their work day to take care of their mental health and their well-being.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point, Connie. Yeah, I think that reaching for these institutionally supported processes where it's not just on an individual basis is hopefully a future we can look towards, and we're hoping to work towards with Act Insight. But I will pass it over to, I believe it is Melanie next.
I don't believe it's me.
Sorry,
Sorry, Nastaran, that's my
sorry,
bad.
I was muted. I'm supposed to come in here. So thank you so much, Ashley, for giving kind of an overview of what we're doing with the interview data. It's all really very interesting. And I love the discussion and some of the points that were made. They're really good ideas coming up in this conversation. So yay and awesome. So now we're going to move on to the concurrent design and knowledge mobilization process that we're currently undergoing. And I will get the slides. I will hand over to Nastaran to introduce our design process.
Thank you very much, Hilda, and Ashley, thank you for the great segue to the next bit. So design process. So what we are trying to do as part of the project is to facilitate an environment for knowledge sharing and understanding user needs and requirements and stakeholder preferences and priorities. And to do that, we're following a very simple human-centered design process. The first step simply is to understand the world, the environment that we will have to work in, and exploring needs, obstacles, opportunities, understanding the scope, framing them, try to kind of define them in as clear a way as possible so that we could communicate them with other stakeholders and share and get insights and check ourselves whether we are on the right track or not. A lot of the inputs that we used for this part is from the interview study that was done, because that's a big bunch of data available to explore. And that then leads into kind of giving it a little bit more arms and lengths, stories, scenarios, personas. These are just tools that will help us to communicate better, to kind of put things in context, put things in perspectives, and then have better opportunities to engage with our stakeholders. The next part is the engagement in more of a structured way. We call it a design charrette. It's really a collaborative session that people get together from different perspectives, different priorities, and they share what works, what doesn't work, what are the frictions, what are the tension points, what are the opportunities that will be derived from all of these potential apparent challenges. From that, we start getting some ideas. Well, by we, I mean the whole stakeholder group. Collectively, we start seeing some patterns, seeing some ideas, and we co-design an opportunity. We co-design an intervention. Group design sessions, we get together, we talk, what works, what doesn't work, what is pragmatic, what is feasible, what are the obstacles for long-term implementations of some of these solutions, what is the short-term obstacles to get them up and running and sorted out in the next 6 months or the next year. So ongoing conversations with the stakeholders, then we then go on to the development. And by development, I don't mean anything fancy. It starts with a pen and paper, sketching, prototyping, writing down key concepts. I'm sure brainstorming sessions, mind map, concept maps, all of those, the usual suspects. Then we evaluate if it works, then go back and forth with our engaging with our users again and go and iterate. And when I say these stages, none of them stops when the other one starts. They constantly inform each other and do a back and forth. And the hope at the end of every design project for us, every research project, every design research project, is we kind of come up with more questions than answers. It sounds a bit non-productive, but once we kind of identify, oh, actually, this is interesting, let's explore that next, that's a good sign. So that iterative approach, as it never actually is complete, it just evolves, is I think what we thrive and what we try to go for.
Okay, and now I'm going to introduce our knowledge mobilization pieces of the project. So there are two big pieces that come in for the knowledge mobilization components. One is really working to support the design process itself. We've done that in a large variety of ways. Just 3 ones that are good to highlight here is we've really worked on creating a really well-established website that has a ton of information, can be used for recruiting and all of that kind of stuff. We help develop a recruitment video so that we can get good individuals at the design charrette so that we're getting really great information and feedback on that. Another piece that we're looking at is kind of building interest or scaling up what's happening within the design process. And we are doing this again in a variety of ways, that online presence. And I am going to talk a bit about kind of this development of this community of practice. One of the key things we're really interested in doing in this kind of scaling up phase is kind of trying to, the project's very focused on healthcare right now. And in scale up, we really want to start kind of entering other spaces or encouraging people from non-healthcare related fields to enter into the Acton site work that we're doing, so that when we are creating this whatever this toolbox or designed process is going to have for us at the end, that it's useful for people within healthcare, but also outside of healthcare. So really looking at kind of the engagement in other fields. Now, a big piece we're doing for Scale Up is a community of practice, which is focusing on bringing together practitioners to learn, share, and support each other in really figuring out accessibility and accommodations in work integrated learning. And so we're really focusing on practitioners here in order to kind of shift the responsibility, which mostly right now lands on students' shoulders, to more practitioners' side for the accessibility and the accommodations piece. And some of this we're hoping will be just cleaning up this process in general, because it is really complex, and in some situations way more complex than it really needs to be. Another piece is with the community of practice is that we are aware that there's kind of a finite amount of time that the Acton site research project has money for. And so there's only so much time that we can create and share and update whatever is produced from this project. And so we needed to start thinking about how is this thing that gets created going to be sustained over time, especially after the funding for Acton site kind of is finished and done. And so we were really were believing that the community of practice right now is very integrated with Acton site, but throughout its development, that it could become more independent and then could become a site or an organization that could take on some of the management, some of the sharing responsibilities in related to whatever is created, so that there is someone or some organization managing this piece, so it doesn't just kind of end up becoming very out of date quickly once it's been produced. And that is kind of our core knowledge mobilization piece. And I'm now going to share with Melanie to kind of talk about how these two pieces are coming together.
Thanks, Hilda. So this part of the presentation is really a story about serendipity, I think, and convergence. And my telling of the story is probably going to reflect in some part my position as like an academic researcher, but I'm very mindful of like the context of the project as being like fundamentally community engaged. So I think the best way to start the story is just to like locate the project as a research project that is funded from SSHRC, which is one of Canada's Tri-Council main funding agencies. And as such, it involved a pitch, right? Like every research project has a pitch, which is the funding application. And that application told a story, you know, from the beginning, you know, the starting point, the front end, which in our case was both a problem from a deficit framework point of view, as well as like an opportunity from an asset framework point of view. And then the trajectory talked about an interviewing phase, which would collect qualitative data. And then from that, we would build and feed into a design process that would be participatory. But the purpose of the design process is to build a thing. And that thing, in terms of the story we told the funding agency, would be a digital artifact. And that digital artifact we recognize from a knowledge mobilization framework is like, you know, a process, but it's a thing to be mobilized. And it's not really different like fundamentally from any other like knowledge output / product in terms of a thing that, you know, goes out in service of some goal in the world. So in the project, the digital artifact was really positioned alongside the other forms of things that get disseminated, such as scholarly publications, the materials we use to generate the data, such as our interview guide, other things that can, when, you know, put into action in some kind of context of use, you know, generate value. So we recognize that, you know, in this process that we had to talk about the things that were being generated, and in the funding application, talk about our plan for mobilizing them. But, you know, in retrospect, upon getting funded and upon starting the project, we really started to, you know, authentically engage with the knowledge mobilization process, which is a design process. Just as the design of technological artifacts are design processes, just like anything really is like a design process. So Nastaran gave a very nice overview of that kind of process, which is not solely or exclusively useful for technological artifacts. It's much broader than that. But you know, really there's an artificial separation between provisioning for a knowledge mobilization process and building like a design process within that. They're the same kind of activities. So we really spent a lot of time looking at how we can converge them. If we spend time thinking about potential knowledge users, really are those potential knowledge users any different than a stakeholder or a user of the outcome of the design process? In the funding application, I should say, the thing that we were going to design at that early outset was centered around ideas of facilitating accommodation. And it was really oriented towards some kind of web-based delivery, a toolkit, we called it. We thought it would be some kind of web-based platform. But as Ashley like very nicely helped us see, the issue is not accommodation per se. It has to do with fundamental issues of access and inclusion. Accommodation is just a socio-legalistic instrument within that bigger picture. So we wanted to pan out and not focus solely on accommodation, but root issues. So this part of the presentation is just, I guess, drawing attention to the fact that the knowledge that's being generated in this project, this community engaged research project, or any kind of project, for instance, more generally, and the things that get generated in design processes are all forms of design, and we recognize that in the project. We see design as like a basic human activity. There are various methodologies, the human-centered design methodology. We have software design methodologies. We have engineering design. We have research through the design. There's all these different methodologies, but they're all organized around intervening in the world. So the project in a broad way wants to successfully intervene to improve the experience of students in work integrated learning, as Hilda mentioned, primarily at this point focusing on health sector, but with a desire to branch out from that. And we also want to intervene, like create a successful intervention from the design process. So although this might seem very like abstract at this point, within the project, we really recognize it as a key moment to like converge these things and to work really hard to build linkages between the knowledge mobilization activities and the design activities. And a really good point of contact has been around storytelling of all things. Modest, humble storytelling, which is so crucial to the design process, both as a communication tool for building empathy and also for the knowledge mobilization design process as well. So that brings us to this slide that has the two things side by side. And I think, Nastaran, you're going to speak on the left-hand side.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you. And thanks for that great, it kind of connecting and merging. It is, I think it makes a lot of, especially after a year on the project, thinking and discussing. And so stories to us is a very simple and humble tool. We stories and personas is our classic cases of, oh, let's find a replica user. Let's think about an audience, because we are hoping to identify user needs and user requirements, and personas is our way of kind of getting into that world. So once we were trying to kind of get that, we decided that, well, we want to come back. We don't want to have like the problem of accessibility and access is a little bit more complex and more layered. It's socio-technical, and just having stereotypical users, stereotypical personas is not necessarily going to give us that depth of knowledge, that depth of input that we want to then feed into the rest of the design. So then we said, okay, let's put it into a story context. So what we did is, together as part of the team, we looked into the interview data. So that is our, homage to the interview, the contextual qualitative interview stuff that Ashley presented. So we looked into that and we said, look at every single role and understand each and every one of these roles are a representative stakeholder, because we were talking to the stakeholders. So once we did that, we kind of said, okay, these roles have a story within themselves. Like in that narrative, they're talking about different aspects, different flows, different processes, different pain points, different motivations, different all of the things that the interview focused on. But every single one of those roles were then reviewed independently to understand their lives and their world. And then from that, we kind of started understanding, okay, these could be actors. These are people who play a role in the accommodation process, and what is their pressure points and how those pressure points kind of reveal some, interesting aspects that could be like the key and the theme of the story. And then from that, we kind of started shaping up our story. And I kind of find that connection between what's happening in the interview and then how actors were highlighted, and then looking at people with the same roles, actors with the same roles, and what patterns will emerge did lead us to, I hope, interesting and relevant stories to then pursue and use as more meaningful design tools, essentially.
Great. So thanks for that. I'm thinking how to connect up. So Nastaran's discussion is talking about the design process and looking at the personae within it, which are a way of thinking. Like design is about imagining, right? The future and how the thing that is going to be created is potentially going to be used. And that necessarily involves conceiving of the user. Now it's very complex. There's all sorts of different users. So we use the notion of archetype to characterize like categories. And that construct is also very relevant in the knowledge mobilization side, where we're looking at the environmental scan, which is, in what way does the process operate? How is the accommodation process deployed within the broader system of the placements within which students go to work and all the array of professionals around that to make it happen, and looking at the specific situation of students with disabilities. So in that system, we think about how can we conceive of the potential users of the things that are going to be created within the research project, the design output among them. So it's a different way of slicing the pie, really. So in that construction and in this focus on the environmental scan, we are building a story of use, where the story of use talks about the use of the knowledge outputs and the knowledge products. So we, in the design process, position the knowledge users in that design process. And the knowledge products and the actors are positioned as mediators in knowledge uptake and mobilization. So that's the point of contact between the two things. And just as Nastaran is talking about the pressure points in a concept of a designed artifact, there are also pressure points in the use and the uptake and the mobilization of the knowledge products as well. So there really is this like mirroring between the two processes. I think that's the best way I can think to align the two. I don't know, Nastaran, did I miss something? Did you want to add anything further to that?
No, that was great. That was great. And I guess what then would be amazing by this connection is then we can, because the stories are more meaningful and they are then the knowledge products that are applicable to that story. So you're kind of thinking about the connection between the outputs and the connection between the yeah. So I'm just trying to build that knowledge product element inside of the stories, because then that would be a tool for understanding the impact. That would be the tool to understand how effective this potential intervention is. And it would kind of give us a roadmap to how we can kind of evaluate as well, which I think it's a big problem for designers, because often they don't have a realistic context to see the effectiveness in practice, essentially.
Yeah, and that's where the knowledge mobilization processes are really helpful, because the theories of change then become a framework whereby design interventions can have their effects in the world.
Yeah, yes, totally.
We're going to run down the whole clock on this slide.
Well, it is the meat of what we're talking about. So we were going to go into breakout rooms, but I think we have a small enough group that if Laura shares the link, I can just pull it up and we can all look at the Miro board together.
The instructions are gone now. Are they also on the Miro board?
Well,
okay, well, we'll see.
I didn't think about that. Changing things on the fly, maybe not the best idea.
It's tough.
But I will introduce the Miro board. So the Miro board, we put this together just to provide an example, and we have it set up for multiple groups. To kind of see the process that we went through. So here in this box, you can see this is all the different, it gives you kind of a bit of an idea of the different pieces of data that we brought together to bring together to create characters for the stories that we're developing. So the first thing we really looked at was the Act Insight process. So like looking at these different sources of interview data, environmental scan, we had some social mapping, bringing these all together, as well as we had a review of knowledge mobilization sources within interventions. And then from the interview data, we were able to connect up the different kinds of roles that were often spaced. We were able to find locations that were people often talked about. We were able to find from the data and the stories that we were working with different kinds of knowledge mobilization interventions that we could see within the stories and the interviews and the different pieces, so that we could kind of list and think about them as we're developing stories. And then we also, from the interview data, found these kind of a huge number of barriers, which we've just added a few here. And then we we're using this process called Storyply by Burke Addison, which helps you develop stories. And what we have here is we have 3, so it has nine kind of these different squares that you go through to develop a story. And we have 3 of them here. So if people would like, you can either go through kind of these 3 squares to get a bit of an experience of what it might be like to make a story, or you can just go around and see the different kinds of data and ask some questions with the time that we have left.
I don't want to mess it up. So what is it exactly you want us to do?
So,
so nice.
I mean, this was made for like today and for people to play in. So on the left side of the screen, you can see there's like sticky notes, there's squares, you can draw, you can do whatever you want if you want to like try making out a story. Or if you have some questions, you can just ask them. And I did say we were going to give visual descriptions, and then I failed to give visual descriptions of the images that were on here. So there are frames called the story development tool. Under there are 3 black squares. And the first one says, what is the goal? And it has different colored stickies and where you could put down different ideas for the goals that you have for either an actor or a character that you're working specifically with, or your own specific goals for a story itself. And then below that, the second black square is 3 circles that converge together like a Venn diagram. And one says people / characters, the other one says barriers / solutions, and then the third one says places, settings. So these get you to start bringing all these pieces together so you can see what might come together to make your story. And then the third black square is titled, What are the consequences? So there's a couple steps before this that look very similar. And the idea is that you start with like the beginning point of your story, and then you kind of outline kind of what's going to happen, both in terms of consequences, good, bad, and the different pieces there. Okay, so Kate has a comment. She says, I just have one comment from the Work Learn Institute. Before I joined the team, my colleagues did some work on accessibility tools for cooperative education. Oh, that's amazing. You might be interested in that. Very much so. Thank you so much for sharing that. And then Susan said, no, but this way was very helpful for working we are initiating. Thank you. Okay. Well, if you are interested further in the work that ActInsight is doing, feel free to check out our website. It's actinsight.ca. We do have a mailing list where we share updates every 2 to 3 months. And Laura, can you share that in the chat just so that everyone can get it? But I will read it out here so that if you want to go to the mailing list, I've made a nice little bit.ly link. So it's just bit.ly, bit.ly, and then it's /3U67808. Okay. So thank you everyone for coming today. I think that's pretty much all that we had.